They called it the Unity Summit, though few who attended believed in unity, and fewer still had anything resembling humility. Across the crystalline platforms of Heathrow Station, orbiting the gas giant of Alcaris Prime, representatives from over 40 sentient species gathered beneath an artificial sun. Robed diplomats floated beside chittering insectoids. Bioluminescent beings blinked in pheromone-based syntax, while bureaucrats in armor etched with centuries of conquest sipped nutrient foam. At the center of it all stood a circular amphitheater, polished, grand, obnoxiously ceremonial. At each seat was a declaration of cultural pride. Floating thrones, organic pods, gravity-warped columns that vibrated with ancestral memories. And in one corner, nearly forgotten, stood a foldable steel chair. That was the seat reserved for humanity. The humans had only recently been accepted into the Galactic Compacta, bloated interstellar coalition more concerned with protocol than purpose. Humanity's ascension to observer status had come after years of deliberation, hundreds of cultural tests, and more than one veiled insult about their emotional volatility and preference for brute force innovation. To most of the species at the summit, humans were amusing, crude, loud, useful in theory, but certainly no threat, which made the presence of a Terran Marine all the more laughable. Corporal Briggs stood at ease near the human delegation, his armor dull gray and worn at the edges, as if it had seen more dirt than ceremony. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He barely moved. A rifle hung across his chestnut, powered, not loaded, a gesture of discipline. But the others didn't see discipline. They saw a prop. The Virati ambassador leaned over his translation node and spoke, his voice processed through 12 layers of harmonics to sound like a music box being strangled. "Is that one of your soldiers? I thought humans were still in training wheels when it came to military structure." The delegates from the Quarks and the Lethian clans chuckled. The Acherith diplomat, a sapient mist cloud, whirled around Briggs. "Curiously, tell me, Earth Warrior," it hissed, "do you use clubs, or have you advanced to rocks with sharp edges?" Even the facilitator and aged Relkin tactician smiled. "Oh, let's not be cruel. I'm sure humans follow some rules of engagement." Then came the line. "Perhaps they even have war crimes," the Relkin said dryly, eyes glinting. "Though I can't imagine anything they do would be complex enough to require regulation." Laughter erupted. It's polite but condescending. Some in tones, some in scent, some in bursts of sound that would cause migraines in unshielded beings. Briggs said nothing. He stood still. Helmet under one arm, posture relaxed, but his eyes, they didn't match his body. They weren't angry. Not narrowed, just ... still, watching, calculating, like a man watching a poker game. With all the cards already counted, Ambassador Reynolds, representing Earth, cleared her throat in attempted diplomacy. "We do have rules of war, yes," she said lightly. "We just tend to be very specific about when to follow them." More laughter. Reynolds glanced sideways at Briggs. He was smiling now, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel safe. Later, in the summit's lounge, chamber decorated in swirls of antimatter silk and music, made from gravity fluctuations, military leaders from several species gathered around digital maps and strategic holograms. They were preparing a friendly military exercise, a multi-species simulation to promote interfleet cooperation. The scenario was simple. 3 teams, no lethal rounds, simulated objectives. A show of solidarity and mutual tactics. The Relkin general leaned toward Briggs, clearly amused. "You'll be leading the Terran side, of course," he said, tapping a claw against a floating console. "We'll keep it fair, no advanced war forms or time-skip bombs, just tactics should be fun." "You're serious?" asked Briggs calmly. "About what? Is calling that fair?" The Relkin paused, slightly unsure if it was a joke. Briggs didn't blink. "See what your kind can do," the general continued with a condescending grin. "Let's just hope no one gets offended by the rules." Briggs turned, helmet snapping into place with a quiet clink. "Rules are fine," he said, voice now filtered through the cold hiss of his helmet mic. "But you might want to read up on how we enforce them." With that, he He walked out of the chamber. Behind him, the laughter had stopped. They didn't understand the tone. They didn't understand the calm. They didn't yet know that this wasn't just another simulation. This was a lesson, and Corporal Briggs was about to teach a galaxy. It's full of smug diplomats and arrogant commanders what humanity really meant by war crimes. They had joked, they had mocked, but soon they'd remember. Because Earth didn't invent war, they just made it efficient. The moon of Kelter 4 had been carefully selected for its neutrality, stable atmosphere, and lack of native life perfect. For simulated warfare, or as the diplomats called it, cooperative interspecies tactical engagement scenarios. The humans just called it war games. 3 teams had been organized. Team A, the Kylari Sovereignty, masters of long-range energy weapons and formation tactics. Team B, the Multi-Species Compact, led by the Ireli and Relkin navies using drones, stealth units, and crowd control tech. Team C, 6 humans, under the command of Corporal Briggs, armed with minimal gear and 1 rover for logistics. The exercise had rules: no lethal rounds, no orbital strikes, no targeting command centers. The objective was to seize and hold a central uplink station, simulating control of a planetary communications hub. No side had ever seriously lost a war game. The entire scenario was generally treated like an elite paintball match: clean, controlled, predictable. Everyone expected the humans to lose quickly. Even Ambassador Reynolds, watching from a high-altitude observation balloon, was already prepping a diplomatic apology for any cultural misunderstandings that might result. But something was already off. At 001 of the simulation, Team C vanished from satellite tracking, not off-grid in the usual way. Gone, no heat signatures, no visible movement. Observers assumed a technical glitch. One Ireli technician suggested the humans had simply hidden in a cave to avoid being embarrassed early. That drew a few chuckles. At 023, a Kylari supply drone exploded mid-air. The detonation was small, non-lethal, but it sent the Kylari command scrambling. They assumed a malfunction. At 026, Team A's Southern Recon Patrol walked into a bulk ravine. None of them walked out. At 032, the Kylar commander demanded a rules review. The humans are not engaging properly. He barked into the shared channel. They are refusing formal contact. They're ambushing. Briggs didn't reply. He was too busy rewriting the battlefield, down on the surface. The human unit moved like they had done this 100 times, because they had. Not on this moon, not against these species, but in jungles, deserts, and asteroid tunnels across their own bloody history. The rover intended for hauling gear had been dismantled within the first 10 minutes and repurposed into 3 mobile decoys, each rigged with short-range jammers and crude holographic emitters, mimicking heat signatures. They weren't pretty. They didn't need to be. They just needed to draw fire. Briggs and his Squad 6 Marines in patched armor moved in, coordinated. Silence through the undergrowth. Their boots made no sound. Their visors displayed real-time environmental overlays: wind speed, soil pressure, pollen density. Briggs marked out kill zones not with lasers or digital tags, but with chalk powder. On Moss, he didn't shout commands. He used hand signals, short-range taps on their private comms. And just once, a knife scratch on a tree to mark a fallback path. This wasn't a war game. This was doctrine. At 045, the first public complaint was filed. The Relkin generals. Voice cracked over the intercoms. We believe the human team is deliberately avoiding engagement. This violates the spirit of the simulation. They're acting in bad faith. No one responded. Because at 047, Team B's drone uplink station was hacked. For 2 full minutes, played Terran marching music across every open com frequency, a brass heavy, ominous anthem from a war fought before the Kylari even left their homeworld. Then, silence, followed by a single line spoken in flat Terran standard. Simulated detonation.
Sector 7
is now considered irradiated. All units inside are compromised. The observers tried to override the simulation to reset the zone. Briggs had preemptively locked the admin channel using borrowed code from an old cargo manifest, subroutine something so stupid, so human that none of the alien programmers had ever bothered to patch it. They hadn't expected someone to try and break the rules of the Walgam. Briggs had never planned to play the game at all. By 103, the Relkin strike team attempted to regroup around the central tower. They found it abandoned. Lights flickering, painted across the wall, in a mix of soot and camouflage gel, were 5 large letters. Rule 0 observers debated its meaning. Reynolds did not. She knew. It was one of the first things drilled into every human soldier's mind. Back. On Earth, Rule 0. Survive. Win if you can. But above all, survive. By the end of the second hour, nearly 80% of all opposing forces were listed as neutralized. Not killed, not wounded. Defeated through sabotage, misdirection, and psychological warfare. Team C had no casualties. The Kylari commander demanded to halt the exercise. Briggs finally responded. You wanted to see how humans fight. You gave us rules, we gave you a lesson. Pause. You asked about war crimes earlier, he said. Lesson 1? They happen when you expect people to fight fair in a war? Silence. Reynolds stood slowly in the observer's gallery and set down her prepared apology draft. She wouldn't need it not anymore by the third hour of the exercise. The Galactic Compact's high observer corps had stopped calling it a simulation. They didn't say it out loud, of course not in their reports or in their official statements, but in their silence, in the subtle shift of posture, in the nervous glances passed between species that had once laughed openly at humanity. The truth was unmistakable. They had lost control of the game, and worse, they didn't know the rules anymore. The original plan had been elegant. 3 teams, 1 common objective, shared operating protocols. No lethal equipment, no permanent damage. Just cultural interoperability. But instead of forming up for a clean orbital view-friendly brawl, Team C Humanity's team had declared open asymmetrical warfare within minutes. They hadn't even waited for full deployment. Clearance. They'd moved while the Kylari were still unfolding their tactical drones and the Ireli were giving a pep talk. It wasn't strategy, it was instinct. At the central uplink station, the flag was supposed to be raised in a gesture of unity. All that remained was a scorched ring of ash and a pair of boots someone's joke. No doubt, but it wasn't clear whether it was Briggs or one of his squad mates. The Kylari's elite assault team had reached the site first only to vanish entirely. There, last comes were muffled, heavy-breathing footsteps. Then one word, mine. After that, silence. The investigators assumed the simulation sensors had gone haywire. Then they found the Kylari commander inside a ravine, tied to a tree with thermal cable. Simulated foam poured into his eyes, and the phrase, "Stop underestimating," scribbled on his chest plate in UV ink only humans could see. No fatalities, no lasting harm, but still deeply personal. Meanwhile, Briggs and his team had completely vanished from visual tracking. Compact's high-orbit observers couldn't explain it. They weren't using cloaking tech. Nothing human-grade could bend light in that way. They weren't jamming comes in the usual spectrum either, and yet every drone sweep, satellite pass, and infrared scan came back empty. In reality, Briggs' squad wasn't invisible. They were just operating in ways the rest of the galaxy had forgotten existed. They moved underground, rerouted geothermal heat, wore chameleon fabric keyed to local plant life, and more than anything understood how to exploit psychology. Where alien squads moved with pride and cohesion, humans moved like ghosts. They bluffed, scattered, mimicked. They set up fake camps, false distress signals, bleeding sounds through abandoned helmets to lure enemy patrols into ambushes. They weren't trying to fight fair. They weren't trying to win by points. They were trying to make a point it was. At 3 hours, 14 minutes, and 22 seconds, when the Relkin observer finally snapped, "This is a disgrace," she growled, slamming her 6-fingered hand on the command console. "This isn't tactics. This is madness. Terrorism." Reynolds looked up slowly from her datapad. Her expression was unreadable. No, counselor. It's history. The Relkin's eyes narrowed. This isn't war. There are rules. We've spent centuries developing those rules to protect sanity in combat, Reynolds replied, voice calm. As the void between stars. We spent those centuries trying to survive enemies who didn't care about your rules. Do you know what humans call rules of war? A pause. Optional. Back on the surface, the human team made no declarations, offered no ultimatums. They simply dismantled the structure of the exercise, bit by the fourth hour. Over half of the Kailara units had surrendered. The rest were neutralized with simulated wounds, electromagnetic feedback loops, or psychological deterrents. One group of Ireli soldiers was found in a dugout bunker surrounded by dolls made of mud and leftover rations. Each doll wore a patch, one from their own squad, one from the enemy. Pinned to the wall was a sign in Old Earth standard, "Do not assume we won't go further." The sign wasn't there to scare them, it was there to warn them. Finally, command channels lit up with emergency override codes. The simulation was being shut down manually. Compact observers activated a hard stop failsafe. Triggering a simulated EMP across the battlefield, power dropped. Sensors reset, and into the silence. From the far end of the combat zone came a single sound: marching boots on gravel, 6 pairs. Then a 7th deliberate, heavier. Briggs led his team into the now-lit observation zone, straight-backed, visors down, weapons slung neatly at their sides. No one spoke as they approached. He stopped just inside the view of the main observation feed and slowly removed his helmet. His eyes scanned the room of dignitaries, generals, and political observers, most of whom were now visibly shaken. Briggs raised a hand, not in salute, but as a teacher would, addressing a classroom. "Lesson 2, he said, voice calm. "We don't escalate, we respond. Escalation is what happens when you mistake silence for weakness." He walked forward and placed a single data chip on the console before the Relkin general. "That's a debrief file. You'll find it includes full records of every maneuver we performed in this simulation." He leaned in slightly. "You're lucky, none of them were real." Then he turned and walked out. The doors hissed shut behind him. No one laughed this time, because now, finally too late for comfort, the galaxy had begun to understand. Humans didn't just follow different rules. They followed no rules at all when the stakes changed and when the gloves came off. They brought the history books with them, marked in fire and written in the blood of every empire that once made the mistake of thinking. Earth was soft. The command chamber aboard Heathrow Station had gone quiet, not in the respectful way where one listens out of awe or diplomacy. No, this was a silence made of something raw. Primal, the kind of silence you find in a predator's den after the bones have been picked clean. Screens still flickered across the observation deck, showing replays of the simulation in motion. But no one was watching the screens anymore. They were watching each other, because now the galaxy's most civilized war planners were realizing they had no idea what they'd just witnessed, or worse, what they'd just provoked. The Ireli security chair was the first to break. "You allowed this?" he spat, his voice metallic through his rebreather. "You let these Deathworlders conduct psychological operations on Allied troops in a diplomatic exercise." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, unmoved. "You asked for a demonstration of interoperability. They demonstrated. They committed. Simulated atrocities." "We committed simulations of what's already happened in human history," she said flatly. "The atrocities. That's just biography." The Relkin general stood abruptly, her uniform shimmering with kinetic thread intended more for ceremonial presence than any actual threat. "This is a declaration," she said. "What you've done here is send a message. You've told us that the Compact's rules of war mean nothing to you." Reynolds didn't flinch. "We didn't send a message. You asked a question. We answered it." Elsewhere on the station, Corporal Briggs and his team were being debriefed not by their own officers, but by a tri-species panel hastily assembled from the Compact's internal affairs corps. It wasn't a trial exactly, but neither was it. An interrogation, it was something more. Nervous, like a school board meeting suddenly asked to explain a bear in the classroom. Briggs sat across from the panel, helmet on the table, boots still dusted with red soil from the simulated battlefield. The lead moderator, a crystalline life form known as Fexel, began softly. "Corporal, the compact is trying to understand your decision-making during the exercise." Briggs nodded. "I can help." "Why did your team ignore the no-harm protocol?" Briggs leaned forward. "We didn't harm anyone." "Several Kylari soldiers are under medical sedation." "We didn't touch them. They surrendered when they heard what we might do. You distributed propaganda. You vandalized the Cum Tower." Briggs raised an eyebrow. "Sir, we replaced the Cum Tower's anthem with a recording of our own national anthem. It's called psychological conditioning. It's perfectly non-lethal. You flooded their food cache with hallucinogenic dust." "That was pollen." "Indigenous." "Not our fault they didn't scan for allergens." Fexel glanced at his notes, voice growing sharper. "And the message war crimes begin when war becomes personal." "What did that mean?" "It means war gets dirty the second you make it real." No one replied. "Because the compact didn't know how to fight when the war was real." "Not anymore." Back in the diplomatic ring, arguments were boiling. Species who had once sat shoulder to shoulder now questioned the very terms of their military cooperation. The Ireli accused the Kylari of cowardice for retreating. The Relkin accused the humans of cultural dishonor. The Avox emissaries proposed restricting human soldiers from future operations altogether. It was the Kylar tactician, of all people, who ended the chaos. He stood slowly and turned to the center of the room. "I was on the ravine team," he said. Everyone turned. His voice was tight, controlled, not angry-rattled. "We had terrain superiority. We had 6-to-1 odds, and we were routed." He tapped a pad and displayed combat logs on the central screen. They used sound as a weapon. Fake radio signals, laughter on repeat. Couldn't tell what was real and what was bait. He gestured to a slowed-down clip. A Marine dropping out of a tree, disabling 3 Ireli scouts with non-lethal rounds in 5 seconds. But they could have killed us all. Easily. But they didn't. He turned to Ward Reynolds. "You're not sending us a message. You're sending us a reminder." Reynolds inclined her head slightly. "Correct." Later, in the dim recesses of Heathrow's diplomatic lounge, Briggs sat alone, sipping thick, bitter tea from a steel thermos. It wasn't good. It wasn't hot. But it was familiar. A shadow approached. It was a junior officer from the HFY, cloud-like. "Mostly vapor and photonic matter. They say you broke the simulation." Briggs looked up, expression unreadable. "No, we followed it to the letter. We just didn't assume the rules were there to protect us." HFY hesitated. "They also say you redefined what combat looks like." Briggs set his thermos down. "I didn't redefine anything. I reminded them what they tried to forget." "What's that?" Briggs stared through the lounge window, out toward the stars. "That humans didn't start war. But we sure as hell took it places no one else wanted to go." The HFY said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. In the following days, compact meetings shifted tone. Private military groups quietly began requesting consultation from human strategists. Training manuals were rewritten. Border disputes were suddenly approached more carefully and somewhere deep in the compact's central threat archive Earths. Designation was quietly updated from emergent planetary power to strategically vowel, cultural hazard, unpredictable, emotionally volatile, minimal respect for combat limitations, extreme escalation potential. Guess the compact had wanted a showcase instead. They got a history lesson. And as the dust settled, one phrase began to circulate in hushed tones throughout. Briefing rooms and war councils. Never provoke a Terran when they're quiet. That's when they're planning history's next war crime. 3 days after the war game ended, the Galactic Compact's Council of Tactical Oversight assembled in the sealed war doctrine chamber aboard Station Helier. 9, a neutral ground reserved only for critical threat reassessments. A place where policies weren't negotiated, but rewritten. The circular hall was constructed of black ironstone and dampened with pulse silencers to prevent emotional pheromones and telepathic echoes from influencing debate. A single massive table dominated the space, hollow at the center, its surface alive with shifting tactical maps, species banners, fleet dispositions, and one new folder. File tag: Humanity Field Behavior, or RE-E-E-W, for the first time in generations. The briefing wasn't theoretical, it was real. The Kylar Minister of Doctrine cleared his throat in abrasive vibration through 4 sets of vocal folds and began. The incident on Kelter IV was not an anomaly, it was a demonstration. What the Terrans did wasn't a violation of the rules, it was a weaponization of their absence. He gestured to the data feed. Video began to play, low-resolution helmet. Footage from a Kalari scout, trees, fog, then screams. Fogsion. The voice on the feed was crying out commands. But they were echoed from a speaker 10 meters away. Then silence. Then a bright flash. Then the feed cut. This unit was found 2 hours later, uninjured, lying flat on his back, staring at the sky. Could not respond to questioning. He's still in psychological stasis. Across the table, the Relkan war priest shifted in her seat. The humans used deception as a primary tactic. We have rules, formal challenges, war chants, honor duels. They offered none. There was no symmetry. The Areli delegate, composed of crystalline vines coiled around a hovering, tapped its thoughts into a translator. They flooded our bunkers with heat signatures of wounded soldiers. We responded with med drones. All were traps. Another voice from the far side of the room, deep weary. My platoon heard crying. Sounded like one of our own. It wasn't. It was a recording. One of them looped a distress call from a previous battle. From a species we'd helped evacuate. When we entered the clearing, they weren't there. It was the Virati, thick-skinned, wide-eyed, usually stoic. His eyes were bloodshot. We weren't beaten. We're hunted. At the center of the room, the human representative sat quietly. Ambassador Lee-Mare, no weapons, no uniform, just a gray suit and a hard-case datapad. When her turn came, she stood, walked to the projection pit, and tapped a key. A new set of footage appeared. Let's not talk about simulations, she said. Let's talk about history. Slideshow began. Each image held for only a few seconds yet, which felt longer than the last. Sarajevo, Verdun, Hiroshima, Da Nang, Fallujah, Kinshasa, Caracas, Orbital, Europa, Quarantine. These are not myths, Marin said. These are not dramatizations. These are records, tactical archives, human battles. She looked around the room. Some delegates were frozen. Others looked away. Every time we created rules of war, we did so after breaking them. After pushing past what was considered moral, ethical, or even rational, she tapped again. A split screen. Left battlefield footage from the Kelter IV exercise. Right, archived. Footage from the second siege of Titan, a real war. The strategies were identical. What Corporal Briggs and his team executed wasn't creative. It was copied directly from our own history. Your soldiers fought ghosts, yes, but not of their imagination. Of our past. Silence. She stepped away from the console. Asked us to participate. You asked us to demonstrate capability. And now you regret what you saw. The Relkan priest hissed. You call that demonstration? You sent a predator pack to gnaw at our rules and call it strategy? Marin didn't. Blink. That was strategy. That's the part you're not understanding. We didn't break your rules because we hate them. We broke them because they assume the other side plays fair. The central projector rose slowly. It displayed a word in Terran Standard. War CRIMs. Marin walked toward it. To humans, war crimes are not the first line, they are the last resort. We codified them because we went too far, too often. But in our darkest moments, we discovered a truth the rest of you still find horrifying. She turned, now staring directly at the council. Sometimes to stop something worse, you have to become worse for a little while. A murmur swept the chamber. The Avox ambassador, an ethereal being of floating sound and gas, finally spoke. And how are we supposed to fight beside you knowing this? Marin answered instantly. You don't. You fight behind us. She paused. Or better yet, do you avoid making us fight at all? The council adjourned without a vote. There were no motions, no formal declarations, only a quiet reshuffling of assessments. Later that evening, across a dozen military academies and compact intelligence centers, private memos were distributed. Immediate review of human conflict history recommended. Reclassification of Earth combat teams under Strategic Crisis Protocol. Limit exposure to human special forces units. Avoid direct challenge. Above all, do not assume humanity has forgotten. They remember too much. They've trained to never repeat the same mistake unless it's on purpose. Because this wasn't a war game anymore. This was a reminder of what happens when you ask the monsters to play nice. They say yes with a smile. Asterisk, the war game on Kelter 4 was officially ruled inconclusive, which in compact political language meant it had gone so far off script that no one knew how to write the ending without admitting something had gone very, very wrong. But the galaxy had already drawn its own conclusions. There were no press releases, no blame, no official condemnations. And yet everything changed. Within a week, military academies across the Kailari core worlds began quietly removing Earth from comparative combat simulations. They still taught about humans, just in hushed tones in classified sections behind biometric locks. The term asymmetric escalation became shorthand for Terran tactics, though the younger officers called it something else, Briggsing. It meant flipping the table when you're losing. It meant using the rules not as boundaries, as weapons. It meant winning. Regardless of what it cost the narrative, compact intelligence agencies began compiling internal assessments under new designations: HUMP, R1ME. Higher risk, unpredictable military behavior under controlled conditions. Terra regulars, non-conventional tactics deployed in non-hostile engagements. Legacy doctrine, human tendency to revive ancient, outlawed strategies when provoked. Some within the council pushed for restriction protocols. There were whispers of quarantine, not of a virus, but of a mindset. Yet every time the motion was drafted, someone would bring up the footage. The recordings of Briggs' squad moving through misted forests, planting decoys, whispering into enemy comes with stolen accents, or the footage of the Kailari commander. Once so proud, now silent in his debrief, staring blankly ahead, hands twitching. As if still caught in the trap, the idea of restricting humanity lost momentum because no one wanted to provoke. The political fallout was just the surface. The real consequences ran deeper. Through trust, where once Earth was seen as an ambitious, if naive, young civilization, it was now viewed with a careful blend of caution and awe. Trade agreements were re-reviewed. Cultural exchange programs saw a sharp drop in applications in the human Marine Corps. They stopped receiving invitations to peacekeeping games. Their names were erased from team rosters. Their involvement was labeled destabilizing. Even Earth's ambassadorial staff noticed the change. Receptions were colder, smiles tighter. When Ambassador Marin walked into a room now, the conversation didn't pause it, recalibrated. She wasn't an equal. She was a reminder that behind the diplomatic handshakes and shared tech, behind the Terran jazz albums and culinary samples, there was a nation that had learned to win wars when losing was already guaranteed. Briggs returned to the human fleet in silence, no medals, no reprimands. It's just a line in his file marked exemplar conduct, irregular engagement zone. That was enough. He didn't want applause. He wanted results, and he got them. 3 weeks later, when a pirate faction hijacked a mining station in an unregulated system and compact forces hesitated to act, Earth responded in 6 hours. 1 cruiser, 12 Marines. Briggs led the insertion. The pirates were captured alive. All of them. When asked by the compact how they managed it so cleanly, the human commander responded simply, "We let Briggs plan it." They surrendered before he got halfway through the strategy. The room had gone silent. Someone asked what the second half of the strategy had been. Nobody wanted to find out. On a world called Mirren 6, children began playing a new game. They didn't call it Soldier anymore. They called it Tehran. One would run ahead with a stick, dive behind cover, shout fake orders. The others would scatter, pretending to be caught in traps they didn't see. Some parents were horrified. Others watched in silence. Wondering what it said about the future? Back in the depths of Compact's strategic headquarters, a committee of 12 gathered to revise the doctrine of controlled warfare, an ancient scroll of tactical ethics and mutual combat guidelines dating back 2,000 years. It had not been updated in centuries. Now, for the first time, a new line was added. Clause 42, when engaging with species of death world origin, assume that all rules may be interpreted as weapons. Proceed accordingly. It was the most controversial amendment in Compact history, but no one dared vote against it, because even the most arrogant among them had seen what happened when a quiet Marine stepped into a simulated war zone and walked out having taught the entire galaxy what fear really looks like when it wears a polite smile and obeys every regulation, just long enough to bury you under the loopholes. The Compact didn't trust humans anymore, but they didn't challenge them either. And in the cold vacuum of interstellar politics, that was far more telling. Asterisk, the stars over Kelter, for no longer, shimmered with the same innocence. What had once been a dull gray moon chosen for its neutrality now bore the weight of legend. No monuments were built, no official records were kept. But among soldiers, strategists, and species who understood the quiet language of fear, it became known as the place where the rules broke down and where humanity didn't. Months passed. The Compact resumed its routines. Councils met, trade deals negotiated, patrol fleets cycled through contested zones. But something had shifted in the invisible equations of power. The galaxy had updated its mental map, redrawing not borders, but boundaries of behavior. Humanity hadn't claimed more territory. They'd claimed something far rarer: psychological superiority. Whispers spread faster than couriers. In the barracks of Kylari warships, new recruits were told tales of a Terran who could imitate your language, your scent, your footsteps, and lead your entire unit into an ambush you believed you walked into yourself. In the Relkin academies, cadets trained blindfolded in maze corridors, taught not to trust any sound, even their own commander's voice, because a human had once used a perfect mimic to turn an entire company on itself during a simulation. In the crystalline libraries of the Ireli, old doctrines were now archived under red symbols. Do not use in proximity to Terran units. Among the Acherith scribes, a poem began to circulate. They smiled as guests and left as ghosts, taught us war through silent boasts. No flags they raised, no oaths they swore, just rules they bent. And then the floor, it was called simply Briggsing. Corporal Briggs never knew how far his shadow stretched. He didn't need to. He had returned to Earth, not with medals, but with silence. He kept to himself mostly. Taught at the Terran Inter-Service Academia, converted bunker beneath the Alps, where gravity was dialed heavier, sim rounds burned hotter, and recruits left every course 2 inches shorter than they entered. He didn't brag, didn't tell stories. But every so often in the final hour of a lecture, he'd stop mid-sentence. Look out at the cadets, tired, bruised, unsure of their future. Then he'd say something simple. Something like, if they laugh at you, let them. Or, every rule is a test. Every war is a warning. Or the one he said most often, if you do it right, they'll never ask you to do it again. And they listened. Because by then, every human soldier knew the story of Kelter 4. They'd seen the footage. They'd read the reports that barely contained the truth between redacted lines. They knew that one man, the squad and no real weapons, had taken a ceremonial game and turned it into a doctrine-shattering case study. But the galaxy had a short memory. It always does. A few years later, on the edges of Compact territory, a new species made contact, technologically advanced, diplomatically naive, and naturally arrogant. They met the other races, joined councils, signed treaties, and then, in a private summit on a station above a gas giant, one of their generals asked the question, If the humans are so dangerous, why do they follow your rules? Sarcastic. Just ignorant. He truly didn't understand. And that's when an old Kylari war advisor in the corner, decorated, scarred, quiet, stood up. His voice was tired. The way a mountain is tired after standing for centuries. They follow the rules, he said slowly, because they know what it looks like when they don't. The room fell still. You think they obey out of fear or respect? No, they obey because it's easier than letting the monster out again, because they remember what it took to put it back in the cage. And because they assume mercifully that most of us haven't earned a second lesson. He stepped forward, and for the first time in years, the warning was spoken aloud. Don't provoke the Terrans. Don't test their silence. And above all, don't ever ask them what a war crime is, he paused, unless you're ready to see it written in your history books. Across the galaxy. From the diplomatic halls of the Compact to the uncharted fringe systems where no treaties reached, one truth became etched in the minds of those who paid attention. Humanity didn't need empires. They didn't need fleets. They didn't even need a second chance. They just needed to be underestimated once. And when that happened, when someone laughed again, they would teach the galaxy the lesson all over again, not with vengeance, not with anger, but with precision. And a cold, tactical memory that never forgets,